Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Like a clear X-ray or something.
Exactly. Yeah, you break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, broken.
Right. It's definitive.
It's binary, it's clean, and frankly, it's comforting. We expect clear cause and effect in life. But when you apply that expectation to the 2026 geopolitical landscape,
Oh, boy, yeah.
right, like specifically this current Western and Ukrainian strategy to pressure Russia into a ceasefire, well, that X-ray machine is just utterly useless.
It really is the definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, we're
Right.
dealing with assumptions that look, brilliant on a whiteboard in Washington or London.
Yeah, on paper, it always looks great.
Right. The logic flows perfectly, right? Apply economic pressure, target infrastructure, squeeze the population, and the regime will inevitably collapse, or at least capitulate.
But then you overlay that whiteboard logic onto the real-world complexities of a massive, heavily entrenched nation-state.
The theory just starts to fracture immediately.
Yeah, and that friction between whiteboard theory and reality is exactly what we are unpacking today.
It's a fascinating subject.
It really is. So we are looking at a deeply analytical conversation between political analyst Matthew Blackburn and Glenn Diesen. And they have essentially taken a scalpel to this strategy of deep strikes.
Yeah, they really tear it apart.
We're looking past the daily news cycle to examine the underlying assumptions driving this plan. Assumptions about Russian domestic politics, how they perceive threats, and basically what kind of war this actually is.
Which is so critical right now.
Right, and for you listening, whether you're trying to make sense of the latest geopolitical shifts or you just want to understand how power actually functions, this is why this matters.
Yeah, why should they care?
Well, in an environment where everything is flattened into these black and white moral binaries, understanding the actual mechanics of an adversary's mindset is like the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed. It's a masterclass in strategic empathy.
And just to clarify that term, strategic empathy isn't about sympathy. I think people get those confused a lot.
Oh, definitely. They hear empathy and think hugs.
Exactly. It has nothing to do with agreeing with an adversary or excusing what they do. It's really the clinical objective ability to step into their shoes and see the world exactly as they see it.
Complete with all their paranoia and historical baggage.
Yes, 100%. Because if you can't do that, you can't predict their next move. And you certainly can't formulate a strategy to counter them.
Which brings us directly to the strategy on the table right now. The campaign of deep strikes.
Right. Let's look at the actual mechanics of this.
So we aren't just talking about hitting military bases on the front lines anymore. The strategy being deployed involves pushing deep into the Russian rear, specifically targeting commercial assets, energy infrastructure, and economic hubs.
Yeah, it's a major escalation in target selection.
The core logic here is that if you make Russian civil society intimately feel the pain of this war, they will force the Kremlin to stop. And tracing the origin of this idea is fascinating because it didn't, spring out of a Pentagon think tank.
No, not at all. The source material points heavily to Karev, actually.
Right, specifically to President Zelensky's inner circle. If you look at the timeline, this was originally packaged as the Victory Plan and brought to Washington back in the months leading up to the 2024 U.S. elections.
And at the time, the Biden administration really put the brakes on it.
They did, largely out of fear that it would trigger a massive escalation, right?
Yeah.
But the strategy didn't just go away.
No, it was pitched again.
Yeah. And as we sit here in 2026 under the new Trump administration, we've seen this incremental, almost hesitant green-lighting of these deeper strikes.
But the shift between 2024 and 2026 is, it's crucial to understand. The version of the plan we are looking at now is what the analysts call a diminished victory plan.
Diminished how?
Well, 2 years ago, the rhetoric was entirely focused on the total military reclamation of all lost territory, like pushing every Russian soldier out.
Right, back to the 1991 borders.
Exactly. But the current 2026 iteration is far more pragmatic. The goal is largely about freezing the lines of contact, securing a stable ceasefire, and working with the major European nations, the E3, to leverage frozen Russian assets for reparations.
Okay, so the definition of victory has shrunk considerably.
Yeah, but the mechanism to achieve it, inflicting domestic pain on Russia, is still the load-bearing pillar of the entire strategy.
I find the psychological assumption behind that pillar really compelling, though, especially given Zelensky's personal background.
Oh, his time in entertainment.
Yeah, exactly. Before he was president, he spent years moving in these elite Russian and Ukrainian entertainment circles. He performed for these oligarchs. He knows the billionaires in Moscow.
He knows how the corruption operates over there.
Right, and he's seen firsthand how much they care about their wealth, their yachts, their comfort. I'm assuming that personal experience heavily colors this theory.
It almost certainly does.
He likely views Putin's autocracy as this fragile, highly personalized mafia state. Like, if the capos start losing enough money and getting restless, they just eliminate the boss.
You're picking up on a very real dynamic there. And the source acknowledges that Zelensky is not wrong about the deep corruption.
Right, it is highly corrupt.
But viewing it purely as a brittle mafia structure is a dangerous oversimplification. I mean, autocracies, especially one that has survived as long as Russia's, do not exist in a vacuum of sheer terror where one man barks orders and everyone else just trembles.
Because if a dictator's only tool is a hammer, the system eventually breaks down, doesn't it?
Exactly. Putin has survived this long through a highly complex, deliberate balancing act. He manages competing factions,
Like the oligarchs versus the military?
Yeah, the ultra-wealthy elites, the sprawling security apparatus, the economic technocrats, and public opinion. He maintains power by actively winning support, or at least ensuring the complacency of these different groups.
So, if the Western strategy is banking on public and elite disgruntlement to disrupt that balancing act, we really have to look at the Russian population itself.
We do. And that's where the Western narrative often gets it wrong.
Yeah, because the narrative we often get in the West treats the Russian public as a monolith, like they're all either brainwashed zealots or terrified dissidents hiding in their basements.
Right, there's no nuance in that view.
But Blackburn's analysis of the polling data completely shatters that binary. He identifies two distinct camps, the instrumental majority and the moralized minority.
This division is arguably the most important piece of domestic intelligence we have. It's fascinating.
Let's break that down. Start with the instrumental majority. Who are they?
So these are the everyday citizens who are largely depoliticized. They just want to live their lives.
Right, the average person on the street in Moscow or Vladivostok.
Exactly. And they do support the war, but it is vital to understand how they support it. It is not out of some fervent ideological zeal.
Okay, so they aren't true believers.
No, they view the conflict in strictly instrumental terms. It's a necessary transaction to secure Russia's borders or maintain its status as a great power.
I'm picturing this transactional mindset where they're saying, look, we pay our taxes, we tolerate some economic sanctions, and in exchange, the professionals handle the messy geopolitical stuff.
That's a perfect way to put it.
They want the security, but they want to be completely insulated from the physical and economic costs of acquiring it.
That captures it perfectly. They are happy to outsource the violence to the state. What they absolutely do not buy into is the extreme apocalyptic rhetoric you hear on Russian state television.
Oh, like the talk show hosts screaming about nuking London?
Right. When propagandists talk about a holy war against the Satanist West, this majority just tunes it out.
It's just background noise to them.
Exactly. And because their support is transactional, their tolerance for pain is strictly limited.
Right, because a transaction only works if the cost doesn't exceed the benefit.
Precisely. The moment the costs of the war, like inflation, shortages, or a draft mobilization, start to outweigh the perceived benefits, this group wants the conflict to end immediately.
Okay, so that's the passive instrumental majority. Then you have this other group, the moralized minority.
Right. These are the hawkish, highly active patriots.
The ones driving around with the Z symbols on their cars.
Yes. And they don't watch state TV because it's too sanitized for them. They live on military telegram channels. They donate their own money to buy drones for frontline units.
Oh, wow. So they are personally invested in the fight.
Deeply. To them, this war is not a transaction. It is an existential, civilizational struggle.
They actually buy into the holy war rhetoric.
They do. And the irony here is that they are frequently some of the harshest critics of Putin.
Wait, really? Because they think he's being too soft?
Yes, exactly. They don't want a ceasefire. When the costs of the war go up or when Ukraine launches deep strikes into Russia, this minority doesn't demand peace.
They want revenge.
They demand a full mobilization, a total war economy, and massive escalation. They want him to take the gloves off.
So this is where the core flaw in the Western strategy really starts to reveal itself, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because the deep strikes are designed to disrupt the economy and make everyday life miserable. That will absolutely infuriate that passive instrumental majority.
Oh, they will hate it. The West is succeeding in making them disgruntled.
But there's a massive leap in logic happening here. The assumption in Washington is that this frustrated, depoliticized majority will suddenly transform into a mobilized political force that marches on the Kremlin.
Which is just a staggering assumption.
Because frustration doesn't automatically equal revolution, does it?
It rarely does, especially in a system designed to crush organic political organization from the ground up.
Right. It's not a democracy where they can just vote them out.
Exactly. Think about what is required to turn public anger into political change. You need leadership, you need a unifying platform, and you need a mechanism to challenge the state.
And in wartime Russia.
There is a total vacuum of all three.
Yeah, the source illustrates this vacuum by pointing to this guy, Grigory Yavlinsky.
Yes,
He's the leader of the Yabloko Party, which is this old, liberal, pro-democracy party left over from the 1990s Yeltsin era.
Right. He's one of the very few public figures left in Russia openly arguing that the war needs to end because the economic toll is unsustainable.
So on paper, he should be the natural leader for this disgruntled instrumental majority.
On paper, yes. In reality, his party polls at something like 1%.
1%. That's nothing.
It's statistically zero. Key members of his organization have been jailed or exiled. He has no institutional power, no access to mass media, and absolutely no ability to lead a genuine peace movement.
So if there's no political opposition to harness this anger, what about the people inside the machine?
The elites.
Yeah. The source talks extensively about the technocrats. I'm thinking people like Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin or the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, or the head of the central bank.
Right, Elvira Nabiullina.
Exactly. These are highly educated, deeply pragmatic people. They are staring at the economic spreadsheets every single day.
And the numbers are grim.
They have to be. They know the economy's overheating. They know the labor shortages are critical. I would assume that at some point, the sheer math forces their hand.
You would think so, rationally.
Why wouldn't a powerful technocrat step up and say to Putin, look, we have to stop this before the economy implodes?
Well, you might assume they have some grand plan to leverage their economic indispensability against the Kremlin, but the reality of autocratic survival is much more mundane.
How so?
They are simply trying to survive. The economic bloc around Putin sees the data just as clearly as Western analysts do.
They aren't stupid.
Not at all. But they remain completely, deliberately silent on the politics of the war. They don't echo the hyper-patriotic rhetoric, but they never, ever advocate for peace.
So they're just keeping their heads down and managing the decline.
Managing the decline is their exact mandate. Think about the structural incentives at play here. In a wartime autocracy, loyalty is prized infinitely higher than economic efficiency.
Oh, that makes sense.
If a technocrat mismanages a supply chain, they might get reprimanded or, at worst, lose their job. But if they speak out against the war effort,
They face imprisonment for treason.
or a sudden fall from a high window, the system is wired to ruthlessly punish dissent, while it can tolerate a certain degree of economic stagnation.
It's like hoping a frustrated audience will stop a terrible play from continuing. But all the ushers have fled, the emergency exits are padlocked, and the only people in the theater who are actually yelling are the ones in the front row demanding more explosions on stage.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the paralysis.
The passive majority might hate the play, but they have absolutely no mechanism to pull the curtain down.
And the people who are willing to pull the curtain down, the activists, the organizers, the people willing to risk arrest by taking to the streets with placards.
Where are they?
The source reminds us that they overwhelmingly fled Russia back in 2022.
Right, the massive brain drain.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of people left. The organic opposition has already left the building.
Okay, so the domestic political avenue is essentially a dead end. Let's look at the actual physical mechanism of the strategy itself, which is dropping bombs and destroying infrastructure.
The kinetic side of it.
Right. Is there any historical precedent for a campaign of aerial bombardment and economic pain actually breaking a nation's will to fight?
Well, the historical precedent is overwhelming, but it points in the exact opposite direction.
Wait, really? It never works.
Military history tells us that heavy bombing campaigns aimed at shattering civilian morale almost uniformly fail.
The sources bring up the strategic bombing of Germany and Japan in World War II as an example.
Yes. Consider the Allied bombing of Dresden or the firebombing of Tokyo. The devastation was absolute, yet the civilian populations did not rise up and overthrow their governments to demand surrender.
They just endured it.
They endured it, and their governments forced them to keep working. The source expands on this by looking at the Cold War, too.
Like Vietnam.
Exactly. Look at Operation Rolling Thunder in North Vietnam. The U.S. dropped a staggering amount of ordnance.
And it didn't stop the North Vietnamese.
Not at all. And look at the immense tonnage of bombs dropped on North Korea during the Korean War, which literally leveled nearly every major city.
And their will didn't break. In fact, the source points out that North Korea only agreed to an armistice when their political backers, China and the Soviet Union, forced them to the table for broader geopolitical reasons.
Right. It was pressure from Beijing and Moscow, not a civilian uprising.
It wasn't because the North Korean population finally gave up under the weight of the bombings.
No, because when you study the psychology of a population under bombardment, a very clear pattern emerges.
What happened psychologically?
Well, the intended effect is to make the people blame their leader for bringing this destruction upon them, right?
Yeah, that's the whiteboard logic we talked about.
But the actual effect is the creation of a profound shared trauma.
Oh, like a trauma bond.
Yes. The physical destruction provides undeniable, visceral proof that the foreign power attacking them is a lethal threat. It triggers a primal survival instinct.
So they don't blame their leader, they blame the bombers.
Exactly. The population digs in. They rally around the flag, even if they deeply despise the man holding it.
Because the immediate threat falling from the sky supersedes their domestic political grievances.
You might hate the mayor, but if your house is on fire, you aren't protesting City Hall, you're grabbing a bucket.
There's an incredibly evocative analogy the source uses here to describe the nature of this conflict. They compare this war of attrition to a brutal boxing match.
Yes, the heavyweights.
It's like two heavyweights who have gone way past the 10th round. They're both battered, bleeding, and exhausted.
Barely able to stand.
But the terrifying reality of this specific match is that there is no bell. There are no judges sitting ringside to call it on points. They just have to keep swinging in the dark until one of them physically collapses from exhaustion.
And if you are going to use that boxing analogy to formulate a strategy, you have to be clinically objective about the condition of both fighters.
Not just the guy you want to lose.
Right. A fatal mistake in strategy is focusing entirely on the damage you are inflicting on your opponent while ignoring the damage your own side is absorbing.
Which forces a really uncomfortable question.
Let's hear it.
If the historical data is so clear that bombing civilians hardens their resolve, and if the domestic political dynamics in Russia show no sign of cracking, why do Western policymakers keep doubling down on this strategy?
That is the million-dollar question.
Is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? Like, do we insulate our narratives from the facts because acknowledging reality feels too much like admitting defeat?
You've hit on a major vulnerability in how modern political narratives operate. The source identifies a deeply concerning trend in Western discourse surrounding this war.
What kind of trend?
Well, if an analyst attempts to do a straightforward, objective assessment of the attrition, say, pointing out that Ukraine is taking unsustainable casualties, or that Russian industrial capacity is actually outpacing sanctions,
What happens to them?
that analysis is frequently dismissed outright.
It gets branded as defeatist, right? Or even worse, as pro-Russian propaganda.
Yes. The logic becomes a closed loop. If you point out a flaw in the strategy, you are accused of undermining belief in the war effort.
And if belief in the war effort drops, the funding might dry up.
Precisely. Therefore, the facts must be suppressed or spun to protect the narrative.
That's terrifying.
It creates an echo chamber where policymakers are reading reports that just confirm their own biases, completely insulated from the worsening reality on the ground.
And when you can't even agree on the basic facts of the battlefield.
Formulating a strategy to end the war becomes mathematically impossible.
That transition from battlefield reality to political resolution is where things get even more complicated. Because if this pressure campaign won't magically force Russia to accept the West's terms, we need to take a hard look at what those terms actually are.
We really do.
We keep throwing around the word peace, but it's painfully obvious that Kyiv, London, and Moscow are not using the same dictionary.
The ambiguity of the term peace is perhaps the greatest stumbling block right now.
Okay, let's break down how the EU and the UK define a successful peace settlement, according to the source.
Okay, so their baseline requires a ceasefire, followed by a guaranteed pathway for Ukraine to join NATO.
Which is a huge sticking point.
Massive. It also involves deploying NATO peacekeepers into Ukrainian territory to secure the lines. It demands the eventual return of all occupied territories, including Crimea.
And the money?
Right. Finally, it requires Russia to pay massive reparations, which would likely be funded by the West officially seizing those frozen Russian sovereign assets.
Okay, that is the Western definition of a just peace. Now, put on that hat of strategic empathy we talked about earlier.
Oh, this is where it gets dark.
How does the Kremlin read that exact same document?
To the Russian political and security establishment, that is not a peace offer. That is a blueprint for their strategic dismantling.
Really?
Yes. They view the insertion of NATO infrastructure into Ukraine as a permanent, existential knife at their throat.
But the West says NATO is a defensive alliance.
As the source notes, it doesn't matter if Western diplomats genuinely believe NATO is a purely defensive alliance. What matters is that the Kremlin perceives it as an aggressive instrument designed to weaken Russian power.
And they will base all of their military decisions on that perception.
Exactly.
It's the ultimate example of talking past each other. It's like trying to negotiate a corporate merger, where one side thinks they're offering a generous buyout package, and the other side views it as a hostile takeover designed to liquidate their company and fire everyone.
They aren't even having the same conversation.
And I feel like this misalignment is made so much worse by this overriding narrative we hear constantly in the media, the autocracy versus democracy framing.
Oh, that framing is so pervasive.
The common wisdom is that Putin invaded simply because he is terrified of a successful, thriving democracy sitting on his border, because it might inspire his own people to overthrow him.
Yeah, the source pushes back on that framing very aggressively.
Why?
Because they argue that treating this purely as an ideological clash between governance systems is analytically dangerous.
Dangerous how?
If you frame the war as the forces of democracy fighting the forces of autocracy, you are framing it as a zero-sum existential battle. By definition, a war between two inherently incompatible systems can only end when one side is completely destroyed.
I see. You cannot negotiate a diplomatic compromise between existence and non-existence.
You can't. And historically, the idea that an autocracy cannot tolerate a neighboring democracy is just false.
Right. The source points out that they exist side by side all over the world without inevitably going to war.
Exactly. Look at the historical relationship between the United States and Mexico during Mexico's long periods of single-party rule.
Or like at Singapore. Right.
Yeah.
Singapore's highly managed political system existing within the broader global democratic market. It doesn't automatically mean war.
Furthermore, the source dismantles the diversionary war theory.
Yes, that's another big assumption we make.
That's the idea that Putin's domestic support was collapsing, so he started a war to distract the populace and rally them around the flag.
But did the data actually show a collapse in his support before the invasion?
That's what I want to know. Did it?
It didn't. The polling data shows that by mid-2021, Putin's domestic approval ratings had fully recovered from earlier dips related to pension reforms and COVID-19.
So he wasn't politically drowning.
No, he was sitting very comfortably. More importantly, the Russian state apparatus was not prepping the population for a massive war.
What do you mean? There was no widespread media campaign hyping up a conflict before February 2022. He didn't need a war for domestic political survival at that specific moment in time.
So if we strip away the he hates democracy theory and the he needed a distraction theory,
Yeah.
what is left? What is the actual threat perception driving Russian actions?
What are they fundamentally afraid of?
Yeah.
To understand their fear, you have to look at how Russian security circles define warfare today. The source points us toward the concept of hybrid war and the fear of color revolutions.
Which is often summarized in the West as the Gerasimov doctrine, right?
Exactly.
Let's define the Gerasimov doctrine for a second, because that term gets thrown around a lot in think pieces and op-eds.
So it's named after the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov. The doctrine is essentially a Russian observation of how the West wages modern conflict.
How they think we fight.
Right. From the Russian perspective, the West rarely declares formal war anymore. Instead, they use a blended toolkit of hybrid warfare.
Like what?
They fund non-governmental organizations, they support civil unrest and political opposition within a country, they weaponize economic sanctions, and they dominate the information space through social media and news.
And the Russian establishment genuinely believes the West uses this toolkit to orchestrate color revolutions, don't they?
Yes, like the Rose Revolution in Georgia or the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. They see these not as organic protests, but as Western operations to systematically overthrow governments in Russia's neighborhood and replace them with pro-Western client states.
And this fear ties directly into a very specific, almost old-fashioned view of what it means to be a sovereign nation.
It does.
The source describes Putin's worldview as strictly Westphalian and heavily Hobbesian. Let's break that down, starting with Hobbes, because that's a dense philosophical concept to drop into a geopolitical analysis.
It is, but it's crucial. So Thomas Hobbes was a 17th century philosopher who argued that the natural state of humanity is chaotic, violent, and inherently insecure.
A war of all against all.
Exactly. And to escape this chaos, people surrender their individual freedoms to a powerful, absolute central authority, which he called the Leviathan.
Right.
In a Hobbesian worldview, power is absolute, and the primary duty of the state is to maintain order and survival by any means necessary.
Okay, so that's the Hobbesian part. How does that connect to the Westphalian part?
So the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 established the modern concept of state sovereignty. It's the idea that a nation has absolute, undivided authority over its own territory, and external powers have no right to interfere in its domestic affairs.
Not at all.
Right. When you combine those two Hobbesian absolute power and Westphalian territorial integrity, you get Putin's worldview.
Okay, so sovereignty isn't just a legal technicality.
No, it is the raw, hard power ability to defend your borders and crush internal dissent without asking permission from anyone else.
And the source points out that Putin didn't just read this in a textbook. He watched it play out in real time in the Middle East over the last 2 decades.
The Middle East is really the crucible where this worldview was hardened. Putin watched the West intervene in Iraq, Libya, and Syria.
He saw the whole playbook.
He saw the West utilize economic blockades, fund rebel groups, and eventually launch military campaigns that resulted in the physical destruction of sovereign states.
And the killing of leaders like Gaddafi.
Exactly.
So the lesson he took away isn't about human rights or democracy. It's a raw lesson in power. If you don't possess absolute hard power sovereignty, the West will simply dismantle your state whenever it aligns with their strategic interests.
That is precisely the lesson. He looks at the Middle East and sees a region now largely shaped by American influence, utterly lacking an independent, sovereign center of power that can push back.
And he's terrified of that happening closer to home.
His overriding geopolitical imperative is to ensure that the post-Soviet space does not suffer the same fate. He demands that Russia remains an independent center of gravity.
And he views Western hybrid warfare as a direct mechanism designed to erode that sovereignty from the inside out.
Yes. Now contrast that with how the West, particularly Europe, views sovereignty today.
It's totally different, right? Since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the European model is based on the idea that sovereignty is actually something you want to give up, or at least pool together.
Exactly, like the EU.
Think of a corporate board of directors. A nation gives up its sole proprietorship, its absolute independence, to join the European Union board. You sacrifice some autonomy, you agree to common rules, but in exchange you get massive economic benefits and collective security.
It's a completely different paradigm.
Right. The West sees sovereignty as a corporate merger for mutual benefit. But Putin sees it as a medieval castle.
Oh, I like that comparison.
You pull up the drawbridge, you fill the moat with alligators, and you fortify the walls. Because if you invite anyone in to share your resources, they're probably going to poison the well and steal the crown jewels.
That analogy highlights the sheer incompatibility of these two worldviews, and it explains why actions that the West perceives as unprovoked aggression are viewed by Moscow as defensive necessities.
Like Crimea.
Yes. Take the 2014 annexation of Crimea. The West accurately describes it as a blatant violation of international law and a territorial land grab.
Right, which it was.
But the source emphasizes that within Moscow's Hobbesian framework, Crimea was a defensive response.
Because of the Maidan Revolution.
Exactly. They viewed the Maidan Revolution in Kyiv not as a democratic uprising, but as a Western-backed hybrid operation, a color revolution, designed to pull Ukraine out of Russia's orbit.
So seizing Crimea was their hard power response to secure their strategic naval assets before the West could consolidate control.
That's how they justified it internally, yes.
This fundamental disagreement over what sovereignty means leads us directly into how Russia demands to manage its neighborhood. The source brings up a really crucial distinction between spheres of influence and spheres of interest.
This doctrine was explicitly laid out in 2008 by then-President Dmitry Medvedev.
What do you say?
He stated publicly that Russia has no desire to recreate the Soviet Union. He claimed they do not want spheres of influence, which implies total domination.
Like annexing territory or installing puppet governments.
Right, or micromanaging a neighbor's domestic economy. He categorized that as an obsolete model.
But there's a massive caveat here.
A massive one. He argued that while Russia doesn't want total influence, it absolutely demands spheres of interest.
Okay, let's parse the functional difference there.
Yeah.
What does a sphere of interest actually look like in practice?
It means that while Russia might not care who is elected mayor of Kyiv or what their tax policy is, they demand a veto over the geopolitical and military alignment of the countries on their border.
So you can trade with whoever, but you can't join their army.
Basically, when a rival great power, like the United States or the NATO alliance, attempts to build military infrastructure or forge security pacts in Russia's immediate neighborhood, Moscow insists its security interests must take precedence.
The source uses Georgia as a primary example of this dynamic playing out.
The 2008 Russo-Georgian War is the template for this.
How did that start?
Well, when Georgia signaled its intent to join NATO, Russia intervened. They utilized existing separatist movements in South Ossetia and Abkhazia to create chaotic contested borders.
Ah, because you can't join NATO if you have active border disputes.
Exactly. By creating that territorial dispute, they effectively blocked Georgia from ever meeting the criteria to join NATO.
But the key point the source makes is about what happened next. Russia didn't march on Tbilisi and permanently occupy the entire country.
No, they didn't. They achieved their goal and stopped. And today, the current Georgian Dream government operates with a significant degree of domestic independence.
Russia does not dictate their day-to-day laws.
Right. But Georgia is operating within a grim geopolitical reality. They recognize they exist within a Russian sphere of interest.
They understand that pushing for NATO membership again would just invite another war.
Yeah, they have learned to navigate the gray zone, balancing their independence with the hard power reality of their neighbor.
The source then introduces the Mexico analogy, which, always ruffles feathers in Washington. But it is a brutally effective way to illustrate the mechanics of great power politics.
It's a classic thought experiment in realism.
Yeah.
The premise is simple. The United States clearly exercises a sphere of interest over the Western Hemisphere, dating all the way back to the Monroe Doctrine.
Right.
Now, the U.S. does not demand exclusive control over Mexico. It doesn't dictate Mexican domestic policy or tell them who they can trade with.
Right.
But if Mexico announced tomorrow that they were entering a formal military alliance with China and allowing the People's Liberation Army to build naval bases in Baja California and install long-range missile systems pointing north.
What would Washington do?
Yeah, what would happen?
I mean, they would blockade the ports and invade before the ink was dry on the treaty.
Exactly. The United States would absolutely use military force to prevent a rival great power from establishing a beachhead on its border. It would assert its sphere of interest without hesitation.
Okay, I hear the Mexico analogy, and logically, I understand the cold mechanics of how great powers behave. But I have to push back here on behalf of the listener.
Sure.
Doesn't accepting this concept inherently mean we're endorsing a world where smaller countries have limited sovereignty? Isn't the West morally and legally justified in standing up and saying, no, international law dictates that Ukraine and Georgia are independent, sovereign nations. They have the absolute right to form defensive alliances with whomever they choose without asking for a permission slip from Moscow.
You've just articulated the exact tension between moral idealism and geopolitical realism.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
The source addresses this head-on. The analyst's position is that while the idea of total, unconstrained freedom for every state is a beautiful legal concept that aligns with Western values, historically and practically, it is a dangerous illusion.
Because great powers don't play by those rules.
Right. Throughout human history, great powers have always constrained the security choices of the weaker states on their borders.
So the argument is that ignoring the reality of power doesn't make you morally superior. It just makes you reckless.
Precisely. The source argues that demanding absolute black and white sovereignty for nations living in the shadow of great powers, refusing to acknowledge the necessity of gray zones or neutral buffer states, is a recipe for inevitable conflict.
Because eventually, the great power will snap.
Yes. You can be morally right about international law all day long, but if acting on that morality triggers a devastating war, the geopolitical strategy has failed.
So if we accept this analytical framework that Russia's primary goal was enforcing a sphere of interest rather than executing a campaign of total territorial conquest, how does that force us to reevaluate the initial invasion in February 2022?
It changes everything about how we view it.
Because the dominant narrative we have all absorbed is that this was an unprovoked blitzkrieg aimed at conquering the entire nation of Ukraine in 3 days.
To reevaluate the invasion, the source draws on the work of political scientist John Mearsheimer.
Oh, I'm familiar with his work.
Specifically, his 1982 book on conventional deterrence. Mearsheimer outlines 3 primary methods a state uses to initiate a conflict.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is a blitzkrieg.
Let's define that because we throw the word around, but what does it actually mean militarily?
A true blitzkrieg requires overwhelming mass. You typically need a 3-to-1 numerical advantage in troops across the entire front line.
Which is huge.
It requires a massive concentration of armor and air power designed to shatter the enemy's defenses instantly, bypass their strong points, and rapidly occupy the territory to force total capitulation.
Think of Germany invading Poland in 1939.
Exactly, that's a blitzkrieg.
And the second type.
The second type is a limited, short-term war. The objective here is not total conquest.
Then what is it?
The goal is to achieve strategic surprise, rapidly seize a limited piece of valuable territory or establish facts on the ground, and then immediately halt to use that leverage to force a political settlement on your terms.
And the third is the war of attrition, which is the grinding, resource-depleting nightmare we are currently witnessing today. But the source argues that February 2022 was definitively not a blitzkrieg.
The military logistics simply don't support the blitzkrieg narrative.
How so?
The analysis points out that Russia invaded a country of roughly 40 million people, with the largest landmass in Europe, using a force of approximately 190,000 troops.
You cannot occupy Ukraine with 190,000 troops.
It's mathematically impossible. You don't have the 3-to-1 advantage. In many areas, the Ukrainians actually had local numerical superiority.
So if it wasn't a blitzkrieg, the source categorizes it as a Type 2 conflict, a limited war with limited geopolitical aims.
Yes. The argument is that the initial push toward Kyiv wasn't designed to occupy the capital permanently.
It was a pressure tactic.
A massive, violent pressure tactic. The geopolitical aim was to force the Ukrainian government to the negotiating table to agree to neutrality, abandon its NATO aspirations, and replace the Minsk II agreements with a new security architecture favorable to Moscow.
Let's quickly define Minsk II for context, because it's the ghost haunting this whole conflict.
Yeah, we have to mention Minsk II. It was the ceasefire agreement signed in 2015 after the initial war in the Donbass.
What were the terms?
The core of the agreement was that Ukraine would grant a degree of political autonomy to the separatist regions in the east, and in return, Russia would return control of the border to Kyiv.
But it fell apart.
The problem was that the agreement was incredibly ambiguous, neither side trusted the other, and it was never fully implemented. It just froze a low-level conflict in place for 8 years.
So in 2022, Putin decides to shatter that frozen conflict, and the source uses a really startling metric to illustrate the idea that this was initially intended to be a limited war.
The bombing comparison.
Yeah. They claim that Russia dropped fewer bombs in the entire first month of the 2022 invasion than the United States dropped on the very first day of the shock and awe campaign in Iraq in 2003.
They use that metric to highlight the initial intent. The logic was to keep the destruction relatively limited to avoid completely spoiling the possibility of a rapid diplomatic settlement.
They wanted a quick deal.
Right. The analyst argues that Putin was essentially resurrecting the theories of Karl von Clausewitz and bringing them back to 21st century Europe.
Clausewitz, the Prussian military theorist. He's the one famous for saying, war is the continuation of politics by other means.
Exactly. The Russian establishment felt that years of diplomacy had completely failed, that Minsk II was dead, and that they were actively losing the hybrid war against the West in Ukraine.
So Putin opted to use conventional military force, not for conquest, but as a blunt diplomatic instrument.
A limited war to force a political settlement, which historically used to be a standard feature of the Westphalian state system.
But this gamble spectacularly, disastrously backfired.
It failed on every single level, and the source explains why. Clausewitzian limited wars are almost impossible to execute in the modern era of mass communication and fierce nationalism.
You can't just fight a little bit anymore.
No. The German High Command learned this bitter lesson back in 1870. You might start a war with limited clinical objectives, but the moment you cross the border, you ignite the nationalist fervor of the population you are attacking.
And it snowballs.
The conflict rapidly spirals out of your control, transforming from a limited political dispute into a ferocious people's war, a total war of survival.
It's like Putin thought he was entering a gentleman's fencing match.
Right, score a few points.
He steps onto the piste, intending to score a few precise, quick points, force his opponent to acknowledge his skill, shake hands, and sign a new treaty. But he entirely misread the room.
Completely.
He accidentally kicked off a chaotic, violent bar brawl where everyone's now throwing chairs, the building is on fire, and nobody is allowed to leave until someone is knocked unconscious.
That analogy hits the mark perfectly. He wanted a clinical political adjustment and got a generational bloodbath instead. And this massive strategic miscalculation was compounded by a catastrophic failure in Russian strategic communication.
Yes, let's talk about the rhetoric. Because if you are arguing that his goal was a limited clinical geopolitical settlement, just signing a piece of paper guaranteeing neutrality, why on earth did he use such wild maximalist language?
It was bizarre.
The source notes he used nuclear rhetoric very early on to establish what they call escalation dominance. But why couldn't he just come to a podium and state his limited goals clearly?
Why the history lessons?
Right. Why did he publish bizarre 1,000-word essays on medieval history? And why did he center the entire justification on denazification?
You have to look at the constraints of the modern international system. As the source explains, initiating a war purely for geopolitical aims, saying, I am invading to adjust the regional security architecture, is viewed as fundamentally illegitimate in the modern Western framework.
It's just an illegal war of aggression.
You can't just say, I want a buffer zone anymore.
So he had to dress it up.
Right. To try and legitimize the invasion, both to his domestic audience and to the international community, Putin felt compelled to wrap the war in highly emotional, cultural, and identity-based language.
Hence the World War II rhetoric.
Exactly. He used the rhetoric of fighting fascism denazification because the memory of World War II is the single most unifying, sacred narrative in Russian society.
But by using that maximalist ideological language to justify what he intended to be a limited geopolitical action, he completely obfuscated his actual strategic aims.
He essentially sabotaged his own limited war.
Yeah, because the West listened to his rhetoric, took it completely at face value, and logically concluded that his goal was the total annihilation of the Ukrainian state and the erasure of Ukrainian identity.
The rhetoric swallowed the strategy whole. When the West believes you are fighting a war of total annihilation, they will naturally supply your opponent with the means to fight a war of total survival.
Okay, so let's pull all of these massive threads together. We have a war that has devolved from a botched, limited intervention into a grinding, brutal war of attrition.
A terrible situation.
We have initial motives that were deeply misunderstood and masked by terrible maximalist communication. We have fundamentally incompatible definitions of what sovereignty and peace actually mean.
And no one agrees on the facts.
Right, and layered on top of all of this, we have a Western strategy of pressure through deep strikes that completely ignores the reality of Russian domestic politics.
It is a terrifying knot to untangle.
How does this actually end? What is the path forward according to this analysis?
Well, to find a path forward, the source first examines how drastically the unwritten rules of proxy wars have shifted in just the last few years.
The threshold for what makes you a participant, right?
Yeah, the threshold for what constitutes active participation in a war has blurred almost beyond recognition.
Give me an example of how that threshold has moved.
Think back just a decade ago. Supplying a combatant nation with advanced main battle tanks, long-range cruise missiles, and real-time satellite targeting data.
That'd be a huge deal.
That would have been universally considered an act of war, making the supplier an active participant in the conflict. Today, it is standard operating procedure.
Don't even blink anymore.
We have normalized a level of proxy involvement that would have triggered a global crisis during the Cold War.
In this new, highly blurred environment, the source actually acknowledges that the strategy of deep strikes isn't entirely without merit, which surprised me after all the criticism.
Yeah, it isn't dismissed entirely, but it is heavily contextualized. The analysis suggests that deep strikes can be a legitimate tactical move to demonstrate strength, inflict costs, and gain leverage heading into negotiations.
But there's a catch.
A big one. However, the source is adamant that this kinetic pressure is completely useless and extraordinarily dangerous if it is not paired with two critical elements that are currently missing from the Western strategy.
Which are?
Real diplomacy and reassurance.
So it's essentially the fight and talk model.
Exactly. The source draws a direct historical parallel to the Korean War. During the negotiations at Panmunjom, both sides continued to launch massive offensives and drop bombs, while their diplomats literally sat across a table from one another.
So you can maintain military pressure while simultaneously exploring political off-ramps.
You can, but real diplomacy requires a fundamental shift in personnel. You have to get the blusterous ideologues out of the room.
The source specifically points out people like Maria Zakharova on the Russian side, the ultranationalist spokespeople. But they also point out the ultra-hawks on the Western side.
Because you can't negotiate if the people in the room view compromise as treason.
You need cold pragmatists.
Real diplomacy requires mutual concessions. It's painful. Russia has to give something up likely territorial maximalism, and the West has to offer a viable, internationally guaranteed security architecture.
Which almost certainly involves formal neutrality for Ukraine, doesn't it?
Probably.
No.
But even if you have diplomats ready to talk, it won't work without the second missing element: reassurance.
This is a really subtle but vital point. The source notes that the West is incredibly loud about deterrence.
Yes, deterrence is inherently public and noisy. It is designed to be seen.
It's the deployment of armored brigades to the Baltics, the expansion of NATO into the Nordics.
The public declarations that we will defend every inch of NATO territory. Deterrence communicates a clear threat. If you cross this line, we will inflict unacceptable punishment.
But deterrence without reassurance is just escalation.
Exactly. Reassurance is the quiet, essential counterweight to deterrence, and it has been almost entirely abandoned in the current climate.
What does reassurance actually look like in practice? How do you reassure a country you are essentially at war with?
Reassurance happens out of the public eye, in the back channels. It involves military-to-military hotlines that are constantly active.
Like the red phone during the Cold War.
Right. It involves intelligence chiefs meeting in neutral third countries. The goal of reassurance is to clarify the limits of your actions to avoid accidental catastrophic escalation, specifically nuclear escalation.
So it's sending a quiet signal that says, yes, we are authorizing these deep strikes into your territory, but we are not targeting your nuclear early warning radar systems.
And we are not attempting to assassinate your leadership. Reassurance actively manages the adversary's threat perception to prevent them from panicking and launching a preemptive strike.
The source notes, rather surprisingly, that the Trump administration has historically attempted this kind of back-channel reassurance with some success, managing to keep escalation in check during previous crises.
Yes, the willingness to utilize unorthodox back channels, regardless of the political optics, is cited as a necessary tool for managing great power friction.
But right now, the official public stance of the EU and many Western leaders is essentially, we refuse to negotiate or talk to you until the war ends and you leave.
Which is completely illogical.
Which, when you apply basic logic to it, is a bit like a city council saying, we refuse to call the fire department until the building has already stopped burning.
That's a great way to frame it.
It actively defies reason.
Yeah.
You have to talk to coordinate putting the fire out.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, the current Western strategy of relying solely on ramping up kinetic pressure, just turning up the heat on the stove to see how much Putin can take in the kitchen without offering any diplomatic off-ramps or back-channel reassurance, is extraordinarily reckless.
It's playing with fire.
It leaves both nuclear-armed blocs sitting on the edge of an escalatory spiral, risking a catastrophic final exchange of blows simply because neither side has built a mechanism to de-escalate.
Okay, let's bring this vast, complicated picture all the way back to where we started. We've traveled from the inherent flaws in the whiteboard logic of the victory plan to the deeply passive transactional reality of the Russian public.
It's been quite a journey.
We've waded through the clashing, fundamentally incompatible definitions of sovereignty, the European corporate board versus the Russian medieval castle. We've redefined the nature of the invasion itself, and we've arrived at the incredibly dangerous lack of diplomatic off-ramps currently available.
So much to digest here.
And to you, listening to this, why does dedicating an hour to this level of microscopic detail matter? Because navigating a world that is absolutely overflowing with information and propaganda requires us to understand the actual mechanics of a conflict.
Not just the rhetoric.
Exactly. It requires looking past the moral posturing, looking past the black and white headlines, and examining the gears, turning beneath the surface. You cannot fix a broken machine if you refuse to look at how the engine actually works, even if you despise the person who built the engine.
I will leave you with this final thought to mull over as you watch the news in the coming weeks. We've discussed in depth how the invisible rules of proxy wars have drastically changed in just the last 4 years, how the threshold of what makes a nation an active participant in a conflict has silently shifted.
Right.
As you look at conflicts unfolding around the globe tomorrow, ask yourself this: if the invisible lines of warfare keep shifting beneath our feet without us even noticing, how will we know when we've finally crossed the final, irreversible line? Until it's already too late.
That is a chilling thought. And that is exactly why we have to keep peering into the muddy waters. Thank you for taking the time to truly dive deep with us today. Stay curious, keep questioning the narrative, and we'll see you next time.